Emily. All right, so hi everyone again. My name is Lauren Wilson. I work at the Christ Hospital within our Population Health Department. So thank you for joining us today for the Eating the Macros seminar presented by Emily Uebel. Quick summary on Emily. She earned her Bachelor's of Arts from Washington and Lee University in Romance Languages, but decided to return to school for dietetics, earning her certificate from the University of Cincinnati. She's been with Christ Hospital since 2016, first working in the wellness department and then moving over to diabetes education services. She has been with the department for the last 6 years and just this past summer passed her exam to become a certified diabetes care and education specialist. So before I pass that off to Emily, I just want to remind everyone that you will be muted throughout the duration of the seminar. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box found at the bottom of the screen. And there's also a comments or chat box that you can post any comments in there as well. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Emily.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. So let's go ahead and get this started. Give me 1 second while I share my screen. Okay, how does that look? Lauren, I'm using you as the gauge for whether you can see that okay.
Yep, it looks good.
Perfect, all right, great. So like Lauren said, my name is Emily. I am a dietitian here at the Christ Hospital. Any questions? I have the Q&A box pulled up off to the side of my screen. So as questions pop into your head, please feel free to submit those. I know sometimes you think of something and then 20 minutes later it's gone. So go ahead and submit those kind of as they come into your head. I will be monitoring that. I'll try to maybe answer some during the presentation, but there is time at the end to hopefully answer a majority of the questions. If I don't get to them for time reasons or anything like that, I can work with Lauren to kind of gather up any of those unanswered questions and try to get a response to everybody, maybe through email or something like that, okay? All right, there we go. All right. So objectives. So list the 3 macronutrients. So again, the focus is about the macronutrients, the role that each of the nutrient play in the body, talk about the healthy plate for healthy eating, and then give examples of a balanced meal, give examples of a balanced snack, and 2 ways to be better prepared for healthy eating. All right, so starting off with the macronutrients. In the Q&A box, if you want to, who can name the macronutrients? When someone says macronutrients, I'm aiming to eat the macronutrients. What's my macronutrient distribution? What are the foods, the things that come to mind? Oh, here we go. People are in the, there we go. Here we go. I'll open up the chat too. I got some chats. Carbs, protein, fat, and carb, protein, carb, and fat. Protein, fruits, and vegetables. Yeah, so macronutrients are carbs, protein, and fat. Macro means big. So these are the nutrients that make up most of our diet, the nutrients that our body has the highest intake of needs. So when you look at the, not the ingredient list, the nutrition label, you will see these written in grams on the label. We won't discuss them during today's presentation, but then, you know, there are macronutrients, but then there are also micronutrients. And so the micronutrients are the ones that we don't need that much of. Think vitamins and minerals. And so when you look at a nutrition facts label, those are going to be in milligrams, mg, or even some of them might actually be in micrograms when we just need teeny tiny little bit of those. Role of carbohydrates. Okay, so carbohydrates through digestion and absorption variously break down into glucose. Glucose and sugar are the same thing. So when we talk about blood glucose, blood sugar, they mean the same thing. Glucose is your primary and preferred source of energy. It's your brain's preferred source of energy. And so our body needs glucose, it likes glucose. Carbohydrates, when they're broken down, immediately used to maintain those blood sugar levels and are really kind of help to provide, again, that energy for our body to function, to think, to breathe, to move. All of that requires glucose. Excess is stored in the liver and in the muscle tissue. So your body is able to have this nice kind of constant supply of glucose for short-term backup, right? Because we sometimes feel like we're eating all of the time, but not necessarily eating all the time. But our body does need that constant supply of glucose. And so again, that's where the liver and the muscle is able to keep that at that steady level. So with carbohydrates, people like to categorize, I hear a lot of people talking about, oh, you know, simple carbs, complex carbs, good carbs versus bad carbohydrates. You know, in general and kind of throughout the presentation, hopefully, you know, I don't like to categorize foods as good or bad. Categorizing them as good or bad, I think kind of creates this whole kind of problem around, you know, if I eat bad foods, is that making me a bad person? Or are we feeling guilty about eating bad foods? I think it just kind of gives food a little bit too much power, for kind of lack of a better way of saying that. So instead, rather like to kind of talk about foods that we should eat more of and foods that we should eat a little bit less of, right? So kind of getting down to when we talk about simple and complex carbs, kind of what is that? What exactly does that mean? So simple carbohydrates are monosaccharides and disaccharides. And so again, if all carbohydrates are basically sugar or glucose put together in different ways, the simple ones are just like it sounds, they're pretty simple. They're either only one sugar molecule or two sugar molecules. Getting more into the complex ones, you have the oligosaccharides and the polysaccharides. So oligosaccharides are also, you know, relatively short, maybe only about 3 to 10 sugars, versus the polysaccharides can be upwards of hundreds or thousands of them. And so they can get pretty long and obviously, like the word says, complex. The simple carbohydrates, we have glucose, fructose, and galactose. And for the disaccharides, we have sucrose, lactose, and maltose. So those are our one sugars and our two sugars. Fructose, the sugar that comes in fruit, lactose, the sugar that's there in milk. And always, you know, sometimes with counseling, people are always surprised to learn that, you know, fruit and milk are types of sugars, but I always say, well, it's just the lactose and the fructose. So to kind of put it simply, complex carbohydrates are more or less just a bunch of simple carbohydrates put together in different waves. Some form straight lines with loops, while others are more branched, as you can kind of see with the pictures right there. How long they are, what bonds connect the simple carbs. I don't know if some of you know, little chemistry kind of coming on in here. What bonds kind of connect these simple carbs? All of that affects your body's ability to digest and these carbohydrates and how quickly they're digested. So generally, complex carbohydrates are take longer to digest. They stick around in our stomach for longer, just because, again, they're just more complex to break down. Your body has to work a little bit harder to break these down. This is why generally, you know, these more complex carbs are encouraged, because when food sticks around in your stomach for longer, that helps with fullness. And fullness is going to be a really big concept in the theme that we're going to talk about it later on, as far as when we talk about, you know, getting down to what is eating the macros, quote unquote, and with weight loss and weight management. I wanted to throw a slide in here about sugar alcohols. You have patients coming in asking me about sugar alcohols, you know, kind of what are they? Again, this whole idea is, are they good or bad? And sugar alcohols are a different type of carbohydrate. You know, they kind of belong in a group called polyols. And once again, you know, all these different types of carbohydrates just kind of get down to, they all have a different chemical structure. They're made up of the same pieces, but they're just kind of put together in different ways. So a sugar alcohol is sweet like sugar, but not as sweet. It has fewer calories. And so that's where you often see sugar alcohols in diet or no sugar, sugar foods like sweets and candies. And because of this different chemical structure, that leads them to be absorbed differently, right? So your body breaks them down differently. You know, how well they're broken down and how they're absorbed is going to be different than, you know, those other carbohydrates, those other sugars that we're talking about. And because they're absorbed differently, that's what leads to that different effect potentially on the blood sugar, but then also too, some of those potentially unfortunate side effects that you hear about with digestion. Because they're absorbed differently, there's less of an effect on blood sugar. That doesn't mean that there's completely no effect. And so that's where I always tell people, sugar alcohol is still a carbohydrate, right? So when you look at the label, as you can kind of see that label here, there's, hold on, my thing is blocking it. There you go, 15 grams of sugar alcohol, and then 18 grams of total carbohydrates. So again, it's still contributing to carbohydrate. So sugar-free does not mean carbohydrate-free, although again, it might not affect the blood sugar in the same way. And then again, as far as digestion goes, how digestion is, and things digest differently. More things that are left are kind of not completely broken down, potentially can lead to GI issues. Again, how the bacteria in your gut, in your colon, reacts and kind of manages the sugar alcohols. That kind of, again, can lead to some of those GI effects. And so again, kind of theme coming on later on, moderation, right? So everything in moderation, just because it means sugar-free doesn't necessarily make it kind of a free-for-all. So the question there's a question that came in that says sugar alcohol is not on all labels. So do we assume if it is not on there, it does not have sugar alcohols? So I'm not, so as far as with what has to be on a nutrition label, I am not as well up to date as I maybe should be with that. But so that's where actually checking out the ingredient list can be helpful. And so you can kind of see up here at the top of the slide, the sugar alcohols are called polyols, and they usually end in OL. So if you see something like xylitol, sorbitol, erythritol, mannitol, those are all examples of sugar alcohols. And so if they're not listed on the label, which I'd be curious to see an example of where they're in there but not listed, you can always check the ingredient list. Ingredient list is a good resource to take a look at as well. But generally, if you kind of look at something and it's labeled, sugar-free or, reduced sugar, and you look at the nutrition facts and there's still carbohydrates in there, pretty good indication that there probably is some sugar alcohol, especially if it is like the candy or some other kind of sweets. Okay. All right, moving on to fat. So when we think of fat, typically we just come to mind, the fat that we eat, the fat that's in food, but, lipids, which is another word for fat, take on lots of different shapes and different functions in the body. As you can see, it's more than just a source of calories. So fat actually does do a lot of stuff for us. Our body does need fat, only so much though. So an emulsifier, for example, emulsifiers are used to combine things that don't mix, like oil and water. And so a lot of times with, low fat recipes, or when people try to manipulate recipes and take out sources of fat, but they don't replace it with something else, that's where sometimes the effect, the end result of the recipe can be a little off kilter, maybe with taste or with consistency. At the bottom right there, you can see that fat can be used for energy if carbohydrates are unavailable. The breakdown of fat leads to the creation of ketone bodies. And so I know that ketones, ketosis, and keto diet are big buzzwords, popular kind of methods of eating and weight loss and weight management, even, kind of getting back to low carb and Atkins style eating. So ketosis is when cells produce ketone bodies faster than the body can use them. Ketones can build up in the blood, and when ketones build up in the blood, it can interfere with the acid base of your body and can actually cause your blood to become too acidic. Body loses water when trying to excrete ketones, and that can cause dehydration. And so in some instances, ketosis, for example, with diabetes, diabetic ketoacidosis is not a good thing. So kind of being in ketosis is not necessarily a good thing for our body, again, with kind of messing around with the acid-base balance. Typically, though, fortunately for the people who choose to do low carb or keto diet, they're still able to kind of, I guess, stay in what we kind of call like an okay or safe zone, because you're still eating carbohydrates, right? So there's still carbohydrates in vegetables, all those non-starchy veggies. There's still carbohydrates in dairy. And so even though you're doing, low carb or keto, you're still getting carbohydrates. So your body still is getting some of that glucose. And so that's where maybe your body is more kind of like supplementing with some of those ketones. And that's kind of where it can kind of balance and not kind of put you into that kind of dangerous state where things get a little bit out of whack or off kilter. So like carbohydrates, different fats are based on a different chemical composition, bonds and how many bonds and double bonds and whether they're straight or crooked. That basically kind of just leads to kind of the difference between all the different types of fats. Straight fats stick together or stack together well, causing them to be solid at room temperature. So when you kind of look at a picture of a saturated fat, I kind of always like that gave a good visualization. You can kind of picture lots of saturated fats stacking together to be solid at room temperature, causing it to be a, saturated fat. Most fats are usually a mixture. But, we kind of categorize them based on like the majority of the type of fat that's in there. And so again, when we talk about fats and healthy eating, variety is encouraged, especially, with those two more fats, those unsaturated or those heart healthy fats. With nutrition labels, and the saturated fats and the trans fats. So I do know that, I have no idea what the timeline is. So companies aren't supposed to be using trans fats anymore because of the negative health effects. They are given however long to kind of work out new recipes and get rid of using trans fats. And so saturated fats are going to replace them. And so as far as products go, still, options are kind of, the idea to keep some of these foods in moderation. Again, saturated fats are a moderation type of thing. But it used to be that where if there was less than 0.5 grams of trans fats per serving, trans fat actually did not need to be listed on that nutrition label. And so that's where still, again, sometimes looking at an ingredient list to check that out can be helpful. So hydrogenation is the process of adding hydrogen to fat. And as you add more hydrogen, you're making them more saturated or trans. You're getting rid of those double bonds that kind of make them unsaturated and kind of gives them some of those kinks that make them more of the unsaturated fats. So a partially hydrogenated oil is a trans fat. Okay, so that's where, again, if that's not on that label, checking out that ingredient list, you'll start seeing the partially hydrogenated oils. But again, with companies not supposed to be using those, having to rethink recipes and replacing them with saturated, you're now seeing more on the ingredient list, fully hydrogenated oils. Okay, so fully hydrogenated, think that there are lots of hydrogens that have been added to make that fat fully saturated. Hence, those are being turned into saturated fats. Cholesterol is another type of fat. So a sterol is a type of lipid, kind of along with triglycerides and phospholipids. Their role is more related to kind of cell structure. Cholesterol is necessary for our body to make vitamin D as well. When we talk about cholesterol, we focus really on the types of fats that we're eating. Again, this idea of good fats, bad fats, heart healthy ones, not so heart healthy ones. I always think it's a lot easier, when we talk about cholesterol, people say, no, there's a good one, no, there's a bad one. I'm not sure which is which, or I have high cholesterol, but I know it's the good kind. And so I always like to think H for healthy and L for lousy. And it's a much easier way to remember those. And then you want to throw in high healthy HDL and L lousy or low lousy LDL to get that nice alliteration to help remember all that. Why is HDL good is because you can kind of see in that image below, the gunky yellow stuff is the cholesterol, and HDL kind of acts like the cleanup crew. It's actually able to gather some of that cholesterol and it brings it back to our liver, which is our main kind of place for producing cholesterol. And so, like I said, cholesterol, our body uses it in cell structure, in creating vitamin D, just as a couple examples. And so HDL can actually take some of the cholesterol that is in our body already and take it back there. And then the LDL is that stuff that forms the plaque that is related to the heart disease that can lead to the hardening of the arteries, that can affect the blood pressure as well. And then lastly, there is protein. So protein, once again, like everything else, has its building blocks of amino acids, and different amino acids put together in lots of different ways make up the different kind of proteins. So we have 9 essential that our body cannot make, and 11 that, so 9 essential that our body can't make, so we have to get it through the diet, 11 that our body is able to make. So again, protein used in lots of different, for lots of different functions in the body. It's in muscle, bone, skin. We use it for enzymes, hormones, mineral, vitamins, transport, antibodies for immune protection. And then like carbohydrate, it can be used for energy if carbs are unavailable. Our body really likes to use protein for kind of anything else, right? You know, so protein really needs to go to kind of those other functions prior to, you know, the energy, but kind of if needed, it can be made into glucose or sugar. But because it's a much kind of slower process, we don't really look to protein as something that kind of affects our blood sugar, right? So when we're talking about blood sugar, it's always looking at those carbohydrates. So that's why, you know, high protein, I feel like, has become the high protein, low carb, keto, glycemic index, and kind of all of that has become a really kind of hot topic with, because, you know, thinking, well, protein's not going to do anything to my blood sugar, so I'm going to eat a lot more protein. But again, you know, if your body or your diet contains more protein than what's needed kind of for some of those other reasons, you know, then it does get turned into glucose, right? And excess glucose or sugar or energy is stored, right? So, you know, there still is the risk of a super high protein diet, or, you know, kind of overdoing it with protein supplements can still lead to weight gain. So really kind of any kind of excess calories can still potentially lead to weight gain. So again, that's kind of where, when we talk about the macros and this kind of distribution, it's kind of too much of anything is still kind of too much. So with the amino acids, when I found this picture, I was having some kind of scary flashbacks or post-traumatic something with getting back into school, where I had to remember all of the structures and the names and be able to draw these out, and the letters and the 3-letter, you know, shorthands of these. And that is all since completely gone out of mind. But looking at all of that, I was like, oh man, I used to know how to draw all of those at some point in time. I think sometimes food advertised as being complete proteins. I don't know if that sounds familiar to anybody, but, you know, they say, oh, this is a complete protein, or that's a complete protein. I sometimes wonder if that's kind of like a marketing tactic, or if it tries to make it seem healthier. But what a complete protein is, just contains all those essential amino acids. So remember, essential amino acids are the ones that our body cannot make. So we have to get it from someplace in our diet. Once again, variety is key. There's lots of different ways to get protein besides just, animal products. You know, meat, eggs, and dairy, obviously, you know, the kind of obvious choice, but being vegetarian or vegan does not necessarily mean, you know, you're going to be low in protein or anything. You know, whole grains, good sources of protein, beans, nuts, legumes, and even those non-starchy vegetables. So when we think of, you know, broccoli and carrots and green beans and things like that, those have some protein in them. And so again, eating, you know, vegetarian or vegan, still possible to get the protein that you need. And again, variety, lots of different, you know, foods have the different essential amino acids and non-essential. And so just kind of getting a good mixture of them, you usually kind of just get your bases covered. I know kind of a little more back when I was in school, they really kind of advertised complete protein and mixing, certain foods always together in a specific meal, but they've kind of stepped back from that. And it's like, as long as throughout the day, you kind of get this good mixture, you get to cover all of your bases of kind of all these different amino acids and make sure that you get everything that your body needs. Okay. What is the best combination of macronutrients for weight loss? So when people talk about eating the macros, I have patients come in and ask for a macronutrient distribution. What are the best percentages for me to lose weight? So has anybody experimented with eating the macros or kind of followed something like that? Has anybody set up their own kind of personal percent of the different ones in a phone app or something like that? I know MyFitnessPal is something that we recommend to patients. Yeah, so a couple people. Okay. You see here. I have, but have not been very successful. Yeah, okay. All right. Okay, so up my protein because I'm hypoglycemic. That can help with kind of keeping some sugar level steady. High fiber too can help with that. Okay. Calorie King is another one. So Calorie King, I think the Lose It app is another one that people have had. There's so many phone apps out there that we try to stay up to date, and we have a list that we always give out to patients and try and keep that updated, but it's ever changed it. Okay. So the best combination of macronutrients for weight loss is that there isn't one. So wah. People always come in and I think they feel so kind of, there's expecting to be kind of one perfect way or one best way to eat. And that's just really not the case. That just unfortunately doesn't exist. So we have the AMDR, which are the acceptable macronutrient distribution range. And that kind of official definition is, kind of a range that is associated with reduced risk of chronic disease while providing adequate intake of essential nutrients. And that's something that's set by the National Academy of Science. So you can see that looking at these distributions, these different percentage, that there's actually a pretty big range for all the different macronutrients, right? Most of them, there's 20 to 15% kind of difference. And I always kind of tell people, I interpret that as that there's a huge range of healthy eating, right? There's something that is different for everybody. It's not a one size fits all as far as with eating, with healthy eating. Ultimately, I always tell people what's going to help with weight loss is the combination of foods that's going to help you to eat less. You combine that with exercise and movement and a focus on mindful eating. And that's kind of where we get this kind of some kind of push towards this intuitive eating, where I'm eating for these foods that's going to help me to feel full. I'm going to naturally eat less when I feel full. And what that looks like is going to be different for everybody. Some people get more full and are more satisfied with more carbohydrates. A lot of people find it more with protein. Some people find it more with fat. And so again, it kind of, tell people you kind of pick something to start with, and you might have to toggle around with it a little bit as well. But I always like to point out too, what I always think is kind of interesting is if you look at these kind of standards that have been set, carbohydrates is the biggest distribution, right? 45 to 65%. Again, that's kind of that, distribution range with the reduced risk of chronic disease. It's, so you think about carbohydrates should be the thing that we should typically be eating the most of, but just now in this day and age, carbohydrates get such a bad reputation. And so many people are looking to really, really decrease that carbohydrate intake as a means of weight loss and weight management. Somebody came in with a question about what body type or situation would be recommended to eat 10% protein. Protein, protein is, digested and absorbed in your kidneys. Your kidneys are your filtration system for your body. And so sometimes high protein is hard on your kidneys. The more protein kind of end product or byproduct that is floating around in your but in your blood is harder for your kidneys to filter out. And so specifically people who have kidney disease or kidney issues might be on maybe a little bit lower end of the protein. Again, I have to kind of take a look at the patient and kind of like certain situations for that. So that would kind of immediately come to mind. That would be more of, somebody who would need maybe like a little bit less protein. With the traditionally, actually what it was first created for was a ketogenic diet with whatever, again, percent fat and what percent carbohydrates. That diet was actually originally created for epilepsy, right? So this idea of kind of, putting a body into ketosis and having lower glucose levels, that has been shown to kind of help with epilepsy. And so when I was doing my internship in a children's hospital, that was one, these kids who, so sadly, were prone to epilepsy and prone to seizures, they were all on a ketogenic diet. And I'd have to look back at what their protein, percent was, but they were eating majority fat. And so they were a super high fat diet. And so, potentially their diet was low in protein. So generally I say, like, for the most part, unless there's some kind of disease or some kind of background, that would be on the lower end of protein. I think for like a general, regular kind of healthy person, protein needs might be a little bit different. Standard recommendation is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. It's kind of where they kind of start off with protein needs. So healthy eating guidelines. So if you look through the healthy eating guidelines, these dietary guidelines, you can see that they are vague, for lack of a better word, right? There's no specific necessarily mention too much of the specific macronutrients. There's no percentage of the different foods. It's again, I think that kind of brings out that it's really important to emphasize there's so many ways and so many different foods that can be part of healthy eating. It's not a one size fits all. There's always an emphasis towards healthy eating patterns. I talk about, even with my patients with diabetes, it's this kind of very big, broad picture of healthy eating. What is healthy eating? And so it's not getting into the nitty gritty of, how much of this should I have and how much of that should I have? A one size does not fit all. You'll see next to, I think, number 3 and 2, there's a big emphasis on nutrient dense foods. Again, this idea of getting the bang for your buck with the choices of foods. I always also draw attention to next to 4, it says limit. Limit does not mean avoid at all costs and you can never eat these things again. If you eat them, you're a bad person. Limit, again, gets back to that, some more of these, some less of these. And so there's still room in healthy eating for added sugars, for foods with saturated fats, for some salty foods, right? It's just they're not going to be a majority of what we're eating. So again, with nutrient dense, this kind of healthy eating idea of weight loss and weight management, we're getting back to this idea of fullness, right? So an emphasis on fullness. So when we're full after a meal or a snack, that food lasts longer. It sticks around our stomach for longer. We feel full for longer. When we're full for longer and more satisfied, we're not as tempted to mindlessly munch or eat or graze or kind of grab things. The theory of this is by staying full and satisfied, our overall calorie intake can get back to kind of what our body needs for weight management, right? So I'm going to eat when I'm hungry. I'm not going to eat when I'm not hungry, which mindful eating is kind of something that we're not going to get into too much today, but is a whole big kind of topic that I encourage people to kind of look more into, this idea of mindfulness and mindful eating. But so as far as though from like a eating standpoint, fullness standpoint, what are these full foods that help us to feel full? It's fiber, it's protein, it's fat. So again, all foods can be part of diet for health and weight loss. Fiber, I tell me nutrition recommendations, I feel like sometimes ebb and flow, right? And I think there's the egg discussion, and then, there's bread and there's gluten. And I think at one point, bacon, there was like a study that said bacon maybe wasn't as bad for our cholesterol as we once thought it was. So, kind of nutrition kind of comes and goes. But something that I tell people that consistently stays the same is that people who eat a lot of fiber are typically healthier and tend to just naturally weigh less. You can see then on the slide too, the benefits of fiber and how it relates to all these kind of different kind of big disease states that are so prevalent in society. So fiber with obesity, again, lower calorie intake; with type 2 diabetes, high fiber carbohydrates, slower to absorb, a much kind of slower effect on that blood sugar. Those foods aren't going to be the ones to spike that blood sugar and drive that sugar up quickly. Fiber is helpful with heart disease, GI, gastrointestinal disorders. It's food for the gut bacteria. So eating lots of fiber is going to keep that bacteria, healthy. Where do we get fiber? Fiber is in plants. What are plants? They're carbohydrates. So again, this idea that carbohydrates are actually really still a really good thing to include in our diets, and this idea of moving towards a more plant-based eating. That's another kind of big buzzword, is this idea of plant-based. You have a meatless Monday, or meatless whatever other day that you feel like it. What sometimes starts off as maybe a meatless Monday, plans change, all of a sudden it becomes like a meatless Thursday in my house. So fiber, like I said, fiber is in plants. You can see lots of different sources for that. Fruit is here. I always want to draw attention to fruit. A lot of people come in talking about fruit and avoiding fruit because it's a simple carbohydrate because of the fructose. But again, I say, looking back at the dietary guidelines, there's no mention of limiting or avoiding simple carbohydrates, right? The emphasis is really about added sugars. So it really actually doesn't mention carbohydrates directly. Again, it talks about added sugars, but then it once again goes to nutrient dense foods, right? So those foods are going to give me a lot of bang for my buck, a lot of vitamins and minerals, and then there's fiber too with the fruit. So again, those added sugars are going to be those ones that we want to monitor more, because those are the ones that spike the blood sugar and they're stored more easily, right? So if we eat added sugars, it kind of gets into our body quickly, raises the blood sugar quickly. Body doesn't need all that glucose right at once. So it's like, all right, I'm just going to save some for later. And that's kind of where they're stored easily. And that's where foods with added sugars can lead to kind of easy and potential quick weight gain. I always tell patients, when they come in for, counseling for, again, weight loss, pre-diabetes, especially, diet high in sweets and soda is something to always look to change, so much more so than a diet rich in fruit. I tell people, never say never, but I've never done any pre-diabetes counseling. And I was looking at fruit as the reason that this patient, was having high blood sugars. We're never really looking to monitor that fruit intake as something to change in aims of kind of, again, following more of that healthy eating pattern, looking to manage those blood sugars. And so fruit's always definitely part of healthy eating. So are those whole grains right there. There's even corn and some other kind of starchy veggies as well. Lean protein. So chicken, fish, you can see eggs there. Truthfully, eggs don't contain much saturated fat. They are high in cholesterol, but when we look at cholesterol, again, it's more the type of fat that we're eating. Again, that saturated fat that can raise that LDL much more so than us eating cholesterol. And so typically don't put much limitation on eggs. When people talk about, how many eggs should I have per day? Don't really, I usually kind of don't put a limitation on it. Usually maybe try to get some or one egg yolk. Egg yolk actually does contain vitamin D. Vitamin D can be, especially during the winter months, a much more kind of difficult vitamin to come by. So egg yolk is actually a good source of vitamin D. So I say maybe do one egg yolk and then add in a couple more egg whites for some protein if you kind of want to balance it out. There's red meat there. There's some kind of cut of meat right there. Notice it's a lean cut of meat. There's not much white marbling. So again, that's how we keep variety in there. So we choose these lean proteins, the chicken, the fish, the turkey, more often than some of those other red meats. But again, saturated fat is a limit kind of thing, not an avoid. And so as long as we're kind of, eating mostly these foods, not some of these foods, I watch my portion, keeping my portion to about the size of my palm. That's how I kind of keep that balance. That's how I keep that variety. And I always like to tell people, looking more for your palm than necessarily a deck of cards, because somebody who is, 6'2" has much different protein needs than me, who's, at one point, I think I was 5'4". That might have changed. But so our protein needs are different, and assumably, our hand size are different as well. And so that's where using the palm of your hand, I think, is a lot easier. There's your vegetarian proteins, and what's missing on this picture are the nuts and legumes, like lentils. With the low fat and the full fat dairy, there's always been a long-standing recommendation to choose low fat or reduced fat dairy products. That's always been from a calorie consideration. Obviously, lower fat, lower calories. There are some new studies kind of coming out, that are kind of noticing that the fat in dairy might not be having the same effect on our cholesterol levels as other animal fats. Think, bacon, sausage, salami, and things like that. The other kind of school of thought is that, again, fat is one of those features in food that helps us to feel more full. So again, if we're more full after a meal, we're going to feel much more full for longer. We're going to have an overall lower calorie intake. So that's kind of where sometimes they talk about, including that whole fat yogurt or the whole fat cottage cheese. But I always introduce, again, that idea of mindfulness. How often are we eating past fullness, or when we're not hungry? And so, I don't necessarily think it's necessarily a catch-22, but that's something to consider. Are you having full fat dairy, but is it actually really helping you eat less? So are you actually still getting more calories in that full fat dairy, and it's not necessarily having that potential, intended effect? So just something to kind of think about. So I do usually still recommend people the low fat or the full fat, or low fat or reduced fat dairy when talking about eating and healthy eating. Ooh. All right, I might speed it up a little bit. Heart healthy fats. So we have our mono unsaturated and polyunsaturated. Again, the difference between them has to do with, the chemical structure. These are those heart healthy fats because they will lower that LDL, again, that cholesterol that's going to cause blockages, and they will raise that heart healthy HDL, the cholesterol that kind of goes around and acts like the cleanup crew. Mainly from plants, but we always like the exception to the rule to make things confusion, and that's with those fatty fish. Most of these that you see here are going to be a mixture of mono and polyunsaturated fat. So once again, that emphasis on variety. Cooking with different oils, eating different types of nuts, so walnuts, almonds, pecans, pistachios, anything like that. Focus is to include these thoughtfully on a daily basis. That's really where you see that heart health benefit, is that kind of intention of having these on a day-to-day basis. So that's throwing avocado on a sandwich, chia or flax seeds in a smoothie, throwing some nuts or something like that on oatmeal. Again, it's that purposeful inclusion into your kind of day-to-day eating. Omega-3s, a lot of people heard about omega-3s, know that they're good for us. Omega-3s are a type of polyunsaturated fat. You can see right here, 3 different types of the omega-3s. You have your ALA, your EPA, and your DHA. ALA is that essential. So again, once again, essential means our body cannot make it, so we have to get it from our diet. So that's where walnuts, flax seeds, different types of vegetable oils, important to include those for us to get that ALA from the diet in order to make EPA and the DHA. We aren't sometimes that great at making EPA and DHA, so that's where still it's a good idea to try to get it from the diet. And that's again where that fatty fish, how salmon is so good for us. People talk about eating salmon, it's because it's a good source of those omega-3s that our body is not the best at making. Why are they so good? Immune system response, anti-inflammatory. I've recently had a ton of people coming in and wanting to talk about an anti-inflammatory diet, and that's, to put it kind of simply, it's going to be a diet where you're making sure you're doing a lot of omega-3s. Okay, so making healthy plates. Most people, I think, have seen some form of this image before. It's replaced the food pyramid to kind of, I think, make it easier to create a healthy plate without saying I need 5 to 6 servings of vegetables. I need 2 to 3 servings of fruit. It just kind of gets, again, more kind of complicated, and you're counting a lot more than necessarily you need to. I think it does a good job of giving these big picture guidelines and putting them into, visual. So, when you look at the plate, you see it's full of nutrient dense foods. All food categories are there, right? There's really nothing that's cut out. It's heavy on the fruits and the vegetables. Again, there's the variety. And then what I notice is actually not on here are the starchy veggies. And so things potatoes, peas, and corn. And I usually tell people those go in that whole grain section. So again, they're all still there. It's just what's going to be the bigger portion on my plate. And not every plate needs to look like this. Not every meal needs to follow this perfectly. But I think I defer people a lot to this for restaurants, for, going to, family and friends places and things like that, kind of making your plate look like this. I think it's a much easier way to still have all of those foods that we like. The baked potato is still there, the macaroni and cheese is still there. It's just now part of that plate versus majority of the plate. Again, there's no one size kind of fits all, but I always like to, when people come in, they want recipes, ideas for cooking. That so often is a barrier with healthy eating. It's just not knowing what to eat. And so again, there's no one size fits all. There's really no, perfect way of eating, but the DASH diet, which stands for Dietary Approaches to Stopping Hypertension, from as far as like a diabetes standpoint, again, as far as just kind of general healthy eating, does come up as a respected dietary kind of eating pattern. So when people ask for recipes, I will often say, hey, check out maybe some DASH or DASH friendly recipes. You can see on this pyramid, once again, all food groups are included. Nothing's cut out. It's not low carb or no carb. Fruits and vegetables and grains are actually, you can see the majority, once again, of what, makes up the diet. Again, just kind of helps to focus on, what should I be eating most of? What should I be eating maybe a little bit less of? Mediterranean, again, I think a lot of people are familiar with Mediterranean. So again, similar to DASH, it's kind of a, quote unquote, respected eating guideline. Again, with looking up recipes, I tell patients, check out some Mediterranean recipes. Those would be a good place to start to really have that emphasis. As you can see that big old section on the bottom of the fruits, veggies, the grains. This is where you can get a lot of those heart healthy fats with the oils and the nuts and the seeds. But again, nothing's cut out, but more of these, a little bit less of these. Somebody asked about DASH. So DASH stands for Dietary Approaches to Stopping Hypertension. And so hypertension is just high blood pressure. All right, so putting some of the stuff into action. Breakfast is often a skipped meal, so I wanted to provide some kind of hopefully quick, easy ideas. Don't necessarily really consider it a most important meal. I don't necessarily think of one meal as necessarily more important than the other, but a lot of two is kind of getting back into that mindfulness, being more aware of my behaviors and kind of my actions and consequences, right? So when I skip breakfast and I get too hungry, what does that kind of mean for my eating and choices later on? That's kind of when I tell people that's when the vending machine or the donuts that are in the break room, I'm just really hungry and I'm just going to eat something and that's what's there. And so if including breakfast helps to kind of chop that off, that's kind of where I was like, yes, then breakfast is definitely really, really important. Lauren has these ideas and also too, I believe the snack ones on a separate sheet of paper. So don't worry about writing these down. I don't know if anybody was kind of frantically trying to scribble these down. Lauren can send these to everybody afterwards. So again, balance and variety, hitting, like I said, that trifecta of fullness. I want fiber, I want protein, and I want healthy fat. Difficult sometimes to get vegetables for breakfast. And so then you just look towards other sources of fiber. Oftentimes people say, well, I don't like breakfast foods. So there's nothing saying that you're limited to breakfast foods, quote unquote. You can do quote unquote later on in the day foods for breakfast. I've had somebody come in saying they had a salad for breakfast, and it's like, go for it, knock yourself out. That's great. You're eating something, getting some healthy fats in there, a little bit of protein, you got lots of vegetables, check all those boxes. Greek yogurt's on there. Greek yogurt's higher in protein than regular yogurt. So if you're not a fan of the taste, I tell people just be mindful of your choices of yogurt because of the added sugar. So choosing plain and adding fruit for flavor helps to minimize or avoid those added sugar. And again, added sugar is not a I can never have it again type of thing. It's increasing this mindfulness. Can I find a way to reduce it? So when I look at that label and added sugar is on the label, trying to find one that has less, right? So if this one has 10 grams of added sugar, this one has 7, kind of go for the one with 7 grams of added sugar, and that's fine. Snacks. So I tell people, I always say snacks are as needed, right? Purpose of a snack is to help to keep our appetite in check, to have better portion control at our next meal, to avoid overeating. Again, that idea of I'm never going to let myself get too hungry, that I kind of just, have that. Everyone kind of, I think, has been there at some point, right? So when you're that hungry, you're like, I just need to eat something. I'm going to eat a lot of it, and I'm just going to do it really quickly. And that just leads to that overeating, right? We eat it really quickly. I'm still not full. I'm going to go ahead and go for seconds. And so all of a sudden, whoa, I've eaten too much. And so, like I said, that kind of just helping keep that appetite in check helps to not let yourself get to that point. That school of thought with 6 small meals per day, that's kind of where that comes from. You're never letting yourself get over hungry. So you're overall better able to manage your portions and your intake. But that doesn't work for everybody. Not everybody has to have those 6 small meals per day. There are some people who are fine with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They don't need to have any snacks. And so if you're not hungry, I tell people never have to force a snack. But again, it's understanding yourself, right? And so if you notice you do get hungry, that 3-4 o'clock kind of lull or break in the day where that energy just kind of slumps, having that snack there, is that going to help me then when it comes time for dinner, right? And so eating at that time and not trying to reduce that intake too much, does that kind of balance it out? So with planning healthy meals, I always, you're more likely to eat these healthy foods or eat how you want to eat when those foods are around. It is necessary to take some steps to make sure then that those foods are around. Planning is a really big helpful tool. I always recommend people to try to plan as much as you're able to. Again, you kind of forget that making a decision takes energy. And so if you've been working all day long and then you have kids and the kids have, practice or any of number of activities, your brain can be tired. And so, making that decision of what do we have for dinner? Do I even have that for dinner? It's exhausting. And that's again where the restaurant, the fast food, that comes into play, which doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? But, we kind of just think about sometimes those choices we make when we're hungry or thinking of things last minute. So that's where, actually thinking of meals that you're going to have per week, making that list, making sure when you go to the grocery store to have all the ingredients for that meal. So come Wednesday night, you already know what you're going to have for dinner. That decision has already been made. So that's one less step that you have to think about, that your brain has to do on a kind of an already, exhausting day. When picking out recipes, be realistic with cooking time. If you only want to spend 20 minutes cooking, that's fine. Dinner might be more simple, but again, look at that healthy plate. That does not have to be anything fancy. Make use of leftovers. Again, if you don't want to cook every single night, I do not cook every single night. I'm a huge fan of leftovers. And consider what the hardest part of the meal is, right? What's that kind of food that you feel like takes the longest. Oftentimes, I think protein, comes up as that, maybe vegetables come up as that. So that's where, do I need to buy pre-cut vegetables? Do I need to buy frozen vegetables? What about microwave vegetables? Any of those are good options. Those are much more kind of quick to prepare than me having to buy fresh produce and, peel a carrot and then cut the carrot up. I recommend bulk kind of cooking protein. If people have a crock pot, you can make a whole bunch of shredded chicken. And then think of all the different ways you can use that shredded chicken for later on the week. That can go on a salad for like a chicken salad. You can put that in tacos. You can do a stir fry. You could put that as like a chicken sandwich. And so again, you kind of already got that one section of the meal already taken care of ahead of time. As far as with restaurants, again, that healthy plate, asking for the extra side of veggies, choosing the grilled meats over the fried meats, smaller portion of French fries. French fries are still there. French fries taste good. We can still eat them. It's just understanding that I'm not having maybe a burger with fries. I'm having a burger, a side salad, and some fries, so kind of keeping the fries maybe to that smaller portion. They're there. We don't want to cut out all those foods we really like, because then when we do eat them, that kind of pushes us to kind of binge on them and overeat. And again, we're always trying to not overeat. We're always trying to be much more aware of fullness and satiety triggers within our body, and with the balance. So spaghetti can still be there, but I'm only having half of a plate of spaghetti with, again, that half of the side of salad with the vegetables, instead of my entire plate is full of spaghetti. So once again, not cutting out things, we're just rearranging that portion. How to make changes last. Consider barriers. I feel like a lot of times when I come talking through all this stuff, it's nothing revolutionary. A lot of times people have heard this, but yet people constantly are like, well, I know I should be doing, I'm just not doing it. And so we think of barriers to change. Once you acknowledge that there's a barrier, then you can problem solve to work around it and actually kind of make it easier. We do things when they're easy for us. And so that's kind of where you think, how can I make eating healthier easier for me? How do I make exercise easier for me? So it kind of applies to both things. Understanding triggers that lead to behaviors that lead to consequences. Again, so think of that behavior that you feel like isn't helping you work towards your goal. What triggers that? What is leading up to that? How can I kind of get ahead of it and change that action? So like mindless snacking in the afternoon, or mindless snacking while you're preparing dinner. It's like, okay, well, I have no idea what I'm doing. I just kind of eat anything while I'm making dinner because I'm just really hungry. Having that planned snack in the afternoon, does that kind of help with that? And does that help kind of keep that calorie intake, introduce that mindfulness to kind of cut down on some of that grazing that can happen? Resiliency, a relapse isn't a collapse, kind of get back on that horse. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's not about seeking perfection. So just because you quote unquote feel like you ate poorly, for breakfast or lunch or something like that, doesn't mean you have to continue on with dinner, right? It doesn't have to kind of be like that. You just kind of like, you know what, that's the meal before, that's not a big deal. I'm just gonna, keep on going. Again, with the problem solving skills and SMART goals, again, setting these specific goals, specific changes. The more specific you are, the more you have that action plan. So I tell people, like, when you were in school and you wanted to do well in class, you said, I was going to, do my homework. I'm going to study for my exam. I'm going to go see my teacher. You had all these specific behaviors you were going to work on. It's the same thing with making healthy changes. I'm going to exercise 3 times per week. I'm going to include a serving of vegetables at dinner. I'm going to only go out to a restaurant 2 times per week. Again, when you kind of set yourself up with that specific action, it just gives you, like I said, a clear picture of what you're going to do, as opposed to, I'm just going to eat better. I'm just going to exercise more. That's just kind of really open to interpretation and what exactly does that mean? Quick plug for our services. So predominantly diabetes education. We do pre-diabetes education, but also nutrition counseling. So non-diabetes diagnoses. That list is what we typically see, but I always encourage somebody, if you are interested in meeting with us, to always have your PCP, your primary care provider, send a referral to us for us to kind of take a look, do an assessment about whether or not we are going to be the best resource for you. And if we're not, we do have other resources to refer you to. And so any questions about scheduling or, things like that, that is our number down at the bottom of the screen right there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily.
Yes. Yes. Sorry. I apologize. That was a lot longer than I actually thought it would be.
No, I thought this was great. I know that we did have some questions that came in. We've ran out of time today. So I have written down those questions that everyone has put in. I'll send those over to Emily and have her answer those. I will follow up with everyone today who attended and give them the attachment that Emily was referring to, and also their contact information for the department. But again, anyone who had questions, I will be able to answer those for you as I have them saved. So thank you, everyone. Next month, we're going to have Scott Reese talk about stress and resiliency. That is happening on April 20th. So I'll be sure to send invitation for that as well. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.